If you wish to develop as a writer, you will have to also develop as a person. I would suggest that you will need to develop a moral standpoint, which will probably also entail a political standpoint. I am not saying that that should be a left-wing opinion, a right-wing opinion, or even my own personal preference, an anarchist opinion. The important thing is the understanding that you should have a platform, a moral or political platform from which you can look at the world and hopefully to understand it, which will need a certain amount of compassion and empathy, whereby you can look at someone who has ideas that are completely foreign to your own, and yet perhaps understand why they have them, what the factors were in their background that caused them to have those ideas, perhaps to understand that you yourself, brought up in slightly different circumstances, may have had exactly those ideas. So that is the basis from which you can look at the world without necessarily being judgmental, but simply trying to understand it. I would also suggest that you will probably need these things to be slightly flexible, because the ground will change under you in terms of politics and morality, and things that may have seemed perfectly acceptable in, say, the heady days of the 1960s. By the time you reach the early 21st century, you might have had some time to reconsider some of those things. So don't become locked in to a rigid behaviour pattern, but you simply need to develop the moral standpoint and the political standpoint which will enable you to have a position to come from. When you are writing about the world, you will need to have a way of seeing these things. Books and writing are capable of changing the entire world, of modifying human consciousness. You are modifying the consciousness of the reader, and therefore you are modifying the reality of the reader. Writing will modify the reality and the consciousness of the entire species, and also, inevitably, will mean modifying the consciousness of the writer themselves. You will also need to develop an aesthetic point of view. What is it that you personally enjoy about, say, somebody's writing? You will need to analyse that, and also to analyse your own writing to see whether you've done the job that you wanted to do or whether you've fallen short and it needs improving. So essentially, what you really need above anything, whatever kind of artist you wish to be, you need to develop a way of seeing the world that is unique to you, that can only come from your experience and your perceptions, and that is the basis that you can then turn into an energy that will fuel the rest of your writing career. But the first thing is to develop that self, the writer as a person, the writer that is you yourself. If I am going to tell you how to be a writer, that will probably entail telling you what writing is, and that means telling you where writing comes from. And as far as I understand it, writing evolved from Paleolithic shamanism. And when that had happened, that allowed human consciousness as we know it at the moment to commence. Yeah, sure, we had something before then. We had awareness, we had empathy. We could perhaps gesture and grunt. But before we could write down the language, we could not retain any information. we could not utilize our developing consciousness, and thus the people who had discovered the wonderful ability of writing would have had supernatural powers in the eyes of the people surrounding them. They would have been able to send their thoughts at a distance to somebody else who could read. They would be able to capture moments, to write down and record events which would lead to the understanding of cause and effect and seasonal differences. These things would lead to science and art and almost every field of human endeavour, all arising from this old Stone Age magic. And when we look at the development of writing and magic, we begin to see that they're actually the same thing. That all of the artistic effects from painting, but especially to writing, all of these effects are things that were regarded as magical powers in the ancient world, as supernatural powers. Such was their force because they could change the world, they could change human consciousness, and they could change the world that we lived in. Essentially, the world that we are living in now is one where we have unpacked our imagination and are living amongst those parts of our imagination that we've been able to bail out from inside our heads. The original bardic tradition of magic was one that was entirely based upon writing and literature. And interestingly, it was much more feared than just your common or garden witch or sorcerer. Now, if a magician puts a curse upon you, then your hens are probably going to lay a bit funny, your child might be born with a squint. These are things that are survivable, they're not that terrible. Whereas, when a bard puts a satire upon you, then that will destroy you in the eyes of your friends, in the eyes of your family, potentially in your own eyes. And if it's a good enough satire, if it is finely worded, then even 200 or 300 years after you're dead, people might still be laughing at you and your absurdity. That was why satires were feared. Now, the early gods of writing, the scribe gods like Odin or Thoth or Hermes, these are also the gods of magic, and I don't believe that that is entirely a coincidence. That, in my estimation, writing and magic are practically the same thing. So, I would like to think that the current generation of aspiring writers will not sell themselves short in this. That you should never think of yourself as purely an entertainer for hire who is lucky to have the work. You should try to remember the tradition that you are becoming part of. You should try to remember that a writer can change the world with their writing. Think of the books that have completely changed human history and see yourself in that light. Because if you are a writer, then the substances that you are handling, the things that you are juggling, you are having an effect upon human history and the entirety of the human future.